The strange thing wasn't that the homeowners association eventually showed up at my front door offering to pay for everything they had destroyed. The strange thing was how nervous they looked when they did it. The president of the association, a woman named Denise Harper, stood on my porch holding a folder against her chest like a shield, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Behind her stood two board members who suddenly seemed far less confident than they had a few weeks earlier. They thought replacing 6 security cameras would solve the problem. What they didn't realize was that the cameras were never the thing that made them uncomfortable. The real system was still running, and they had absolutely no idea where it was. To explain how it got to that point, I have to go back to the afternoon I returned from a 4-day fishing trip in northern Idaho. My name is Mason Walker, and for nearly 12 years I'd lived on a small piece of land just outside a growing community called Ridgeview Estates. The funny thing about Ridgeview was that most people assumed I lived inside it because my property sat right along the eastern edge of their development. From the road it looked connected, but legally it wasn't even close. My house had been built years before the developers ever bought the surrounding land. When Ridgeview was created, they wrapped their neighborhood around my property like water flowing around a rock. Everyone inside their gates belonged to the HOA. I didn't. Never had. Never would. And for the most part, that arrangement worked just fine. I kept to myself. I waved when neighbors passed by. I helped a few people when winter storms knocked down fences. I wasn't antisocial. I just preferred a quiet life. The security cameras started going up after a string of break-ins happened around the county. One family lost tools from their shed. Another had equipment stolen from their garage. A retired couple down the road had their truck broken into twice in 6 months. So I invested in a quality system. 6 cameras covering my driveway, garage, workshop, backyard, and both entrances to my property. Nothing pointed toward anyone else's home. Nothing looked into windows. Every camera was aimed strictly at areas I owned. A deputy sheriff actually complimented the setup once. A year later, footage from one of those cameras helped identify a guy stealing generators from construction sites. After that, I figured the system had paid for itself, which is why what I found when I came home felt so surreal. At first, I couldn't figure out what seemed wrong. You know that feeling when your brain notices something before you consciously do? I pulled into my driveway and just sat there for a second staring at the house. Then it hit me. The camera above my garage was gone. I frowned and got out of the truck. Maybe it had fallen during a storm. Then I looked toward the corner of the house. Another one was missing. My stomach tightened. By the time I walked around the property, I realized all 6 cameras had disappeared. Every single one. I started checking the mounting brackets. Screws had been ripped out. Wiring had been cut. This wasn't vandalism from some random teenager. Somebody had deliberately removed them. Then I rounded the side of the garage and found the pile. Broken housings, cracked lenses, pieces of mounting hardware, thousands of dollars worth of equipment tossed onto the ground like garbage. I just stood there staring, not angry yet, not even confused, more like my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. Then I noticed a fluorescent orange notice taped beside my back door. The heading read Community Privacy Enforcement Action. I actually laughed out loud because I thought it had to be a joke. I pulled it off the wall and started reading. According to the notice, my surveillance equipment violated community standards and had been removed to protect the privacy and comfort of neighborhood residents. Removed to protect residents. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I looked around my property, wondering if I had somehow slipped into an alternate universe while I was on vacation. Nobody from Ridgeview had authority over my property. Not legally, not financially, not any way. Yet somehow somebody had entered my land, destroyed my equipment, and left behind paperwork acting like they had done me a favor. That's when the anger finally arrived. Not explosive anger. The dangerous kind. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into your chest and starts asking questions. Who authorized this? Who thought this was acceptable? And perhaps most importantly, why did they feel so confident doing it? I walked into the house, set my bags down, and immediately started making phone calls. Because one thing was becoming very clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Somebody had made a deliberate decision, and I was about to find out exactly who. The first person I called was Denise Harper, the president of the Ridgeview Estates HOA. I already had her number because over the years she'd occasionally sent me letters about things she thought were neighborhood concerns, even though every time I reminded her that I wasn't part of her association. Most of those interactions ended politely enough. Annoying, but polite. This one was different. She answered on the third ring. Denise speaking. I introduced myself, and there was a brief pause. Not a surprise pause. More like the kind of pause someone makes when they already know exactly why you're calling. I just got back home, I said. Can you explain why all 6 of my security cameras are sitting smashed beside my garage? Another pause. Then she sighed. Mr. Walker, we've already addressed that matter. Addressed that matter. I remember looking out my kitchen window and shaking my head. You addressed it by destroying my property? The board determined your camera system was creating significant discomfort among residents. Residents who don't live on my property. Residents who felt they were being monitored. They weren't being monitored. Perception matters. That was the moment I realized I wasn't having a conversation. I was listening to a speech she'd probably rehearsed. Every answer sounded polished, corporate, detached from reality. I asked who physically removed the cameras. She refused to answer. I asked who authorized entering my land. She refused to answer that too. Then she said something that genuinely stunned me. The equipment has already been disposed of, so unfortunately there's nothing further to discuss. Disposed of, as if she were talking about old furniture left on a curb. I stared at the phone for a second after she said it. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because sometimes people become so absurd that your brain doesn't know what else to do. Denise, I said calmly, you realize I don't belong to your HOA, right? Your property directly impacts the community. That's not what I asked. We acted in the best interests of our residents. You entered private property and destroyed thousands of dollars of equipment. Goodbye, Mr. Walker. Then she hung up. I stood there in silence for several seconds. Most people probably expect me to say I immediately called a lawyer. I didn't. Not yet. Maybe I should have. But something about Denise's confidence bothered me. She wasn't acting like someone worried about consequences. She acted like someone who genuinely believed she was untouchable. That night, I sat in my workshop looking at the damaged camera parts spread across my workbench. Some pieces could probably be salvaged. Most couldn't. The entire situation felt ridiculous. These cameras had never caused problems. Nobody had complained to me directly. Nobody had asked questions. Nobody had knocked on my door. They simply decided they didn't like something and removed it. Around 8 o'clock, I called an old friend named Ryan Mercer. Ryan and I had known each other since college. While I'd gone into construction and property management, Ryan had built a career in cybersecurity. The guy spent half his life working with corporate security systems and the other half breaking into those same systems for testing purposes. If there was anyone who understood surveillance technology better than me, it was Ryan. When he answered, I told him the entire story from beginning to end. By the time I finished, I expected him to be furious. Instead, he started laughing. Not a little chuckle. Full-on laughter. You're kidding. I wish I was. They tore down 6 cameras because they thought cameras made people uncomfortable? Apparently. He laughed again. That's incredible. Ryan, I'm not seeing the humor. Trust me, you will. Then his tone changed slightly. Tell me something. Do they specifically object to cameras? That's what the notice said. Not security systems. No. Not motion detection. No. Just cameras. I frowned. Why? There was a brief silence. Then Ryan said, because I think they just handed you an opportunity. The next afternoon, he drove down to visit. We spent nearly 3 hours walking around my property while he pointed out things I had never considered. Tiny devices attached beneath fence rails. Motion sensors hidden inside landscaping. Passive detection nodes small enough to disappear against wood, stone, or metal surfaces. None of them recorded video. None of them captured faces. None of them stored personal information. They simply monitored movement patterns, unusual activity, entry points, and traffic flow. The more he explained it, the more fascinated I became. Think about it, Ryan said as we stood beside my driveway. A camera tells you what happened. A properly designed sensor network tells you what's happening right now. That distinction stuck with me. Cameras were evidence. Sensors were awareness. And this is legal? I asked. Ryan looked at me like I'd asked whether grass was legal. You're monitoring activity on your own property. Nobody can complain about privacy violations because you're not recording anybody. So they can't demand removal? He grinned. Good luck finding anything to remove. Over the next week, we built the system together. Honestly, it was one of the most enjoyable projects I'd worked on in years. Every evening after work, we'd install another section. Tiny weatherproof sensors along fence lines. Pressure detection near access points. Movement tracking around the workshop and equipment storage areas. The technology wasn't magical. It was simply smart. Each sensor fed information into a central application on my phone. If someone crossed a specific zone, I receive an alert. If unusual movement patterns appeared after midnight, I receive an alert. If activity occurred while I was away from home, I receive an alert. The best part was how invisible everything looked. Visitors could stand 10 feet away and never notice a single component. About 10 days after we finished installation, the system started generating data. Most alerts were harmless. Deer wandering through the back lot. Stray dogs cutting across the property. Delivery drivers approaching the workshop entrance. But gradually a pattern emerged. Certain individuals seemed remarkably comfortable entering areas they had no business entering. Maintenance contractors from Ridgeview occasionally crossed onto my property instead of using designated access routes. Landscaping crews cut corners through sections of land they didn't own. Late at night, I noticed repeated movement near my eastern fence line. Nothing criminal, just people assuming boundaries didn't matter. The sensors documented all of it. Time, location, duration, patterns. No video, no faces, just facts. About 3 weeks later, I attended a community barbecue hosted by a family who lived near the edge of Ridgeview. I wasn't particularly interested in social events, but they were good people and had invited me personally. That's where I first noticed something had changed. Conversations kept stopping when I approached. People glanced toward my property. A few neighbors asked strange questions. So what security system are you using now? One man asked casually. Just upgraded a few things, I said. Must be pretty sophisticated. Works well enough. Another resident leaned closer. I've heard it can detect movement from pretty far away. I smiled. You've heard that, huh? He suddenly became very interested in his hamburger. The rumors were spreading. Somehow people knew I had replaced the cameras with something else, but nobody seemed sure what that something was. Human imagination is a funny thing. When people can see a camera, they understand it. They know where it points. They know what it records. But when they know a system exists and can identify it, their minds start filling in blanks. A week later, I noticed Denise herself driving slowly past my property. Twice in one day. Then, 3 days later, one of the HOA board members parked across the road for nearly 15 minutes pretending to look at his phone. Another board member suddenly became very interested in chatting with neighbors near my fence line. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody made accusations. Yet the discomfort was obvious. They had destroyed 6 visible cameras because they disliked being aware of them. Now they were dealing with something they couldn't see at all, and somehow that felt worse. One evening, Ryan called to check in. After listening to my updates, he laughed. Let me guess. They're getting nervous. How can you tell? Because uncertainty scares people more than certainty. Meaning, a camera gives people information. Invisible security takes information away. I thought about that conversation for days afterward. The more I observed Ridgeview's leadership, the more accurate Ryan seemed. Denise had never really cared about privacy. If she had, she would have spoken to me first. She would have asked questions. She would have tried cooperation. What bothered her was control. Cameras represented something she couldn't influence. Something operating outside HOA authority. The sensor network made that problem even worse. Because now she couldn't even identify what she wanted to control. Then one Saturday morning, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized immediately. Denise Harper. And for the first time since this whole mess started, she sounded nervous. I almost didn't answer. After our last conversation, I figured Denise had already said everything she wanted to say. but curiosity got the better of me, so I picked up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she cleared her throat. Mr. Walker, I was hoping we could meet in person. That alone caught my attention. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone was the corporate tone. She sounded like someone carefully choosing every word. About what? I asked. I believe there may have been some misunderstandings regarding recent events. I actually laughed. Misunderstandings? Is that what we're calling destroyed property now? Another pause. Would you be available this afternoon? A few hours later, I got my answer. Denise arrived at my house with 2 HOA board members, both of whom suddenly looked a lot less important than they had when they were apparently authorizing actions on property that wasn't theirs. Nobody brought legal threats. Nobody brought rule books. Nobody brought speeches about community standards. Instead, Denise carried a folder. We sat on my porch while a warm breeze moved through the trees, and for the first time since this whole thing began, she seemed uncomfortable. We'd like to resolve this situation, she said. I am listening. She opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. Written reimbursement offers, equipment replacement estimates, installation coverage. They were offering to pay for every camera that had been destroyed, plus upgraded replacements. For a few seconds, I simply looked at the papers. Not because I was shocked, but because the contrast was almost funny. A month earlier, they acted like they owned the world. Now they were negotiating. What changed? I asked. Denise glanced at the other board members. Neither volunteered an answer. Finally, she said, We'd like to improve our relationship with neighboring property owners. I couldn't help smiling. That's not what changed. Her expression tightened. Mr. Walker. No, really. I am curious. What changed? One of the board members shifted in his seat. Another looked away toward the driveway. That's when I knew exactly what was happening. They weren't worried about cameras anymore. They were worried about not knowing. Rumors had spread. Stories had grown. Every unexplained movement alert, every whispered conversation, every failed attempt to figure out my new security setup had created something far more powerful than surveillance. It had created uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of making control-oriented people very uncomfortable. Denise finally sighed. Residents have expressed concerns. There it was. Concerns about what? I asked. The new system. What about it? People don't understand how it works. I leaned back in my chair. Interesting, because nobody seemed interested in understanding my old system before they destroyed it. Nobody had a response to that. The silence lasted several seconds. Eventually, Denise pushed the paperwork closer. We would like to replace everything that was damaged and formally acknowledge your right to maintain security equipment on your property. Hearing those words felt surprisingly satisfying. Not because I needed their permission. I didn't. I never had. But because for the first time, they were acknowledging reality. They had spent years acting like authority automatically belonged to them. Now, they were being forced to recognize limits. I reviewed the documents carefully. The reimbursement covered everything. New cameras, installation, equipment upgrades, even labor costs. It was a better deal than I expected. Finally, I signed. Denise visibly relaxed. The board members looked relieved. It was as if they believed a storm had just passed. Before leaving, Denise stood and offered her hand. I shook it. I hope we can move forward, she said. So do I replied. And surprisingly, I meant it. A few weeks later, the new camera system was installed. Better resolution, better coverage, better hardware. Ironically, thanks to HOA money, I ended up with a security setup superior to the one they had destroyed. After that, things became quiet. The warning notices stopped. The surprise inspections stopped. The subtle attempts at intimidation disappeared. Neighbors relaxed. Life returned to normal, at least on the surface. Because here's the part nobody at Ridgeview ever learned. The cameras weren't my primary security system anymore. Not even close. The sensor network remained exactly where it had always been. Hidden along fence lines, tucked inside landscaping, watching movement patterns, monitoring activity, quietly doing its job 24 hours a day. It never recorded faces. It never violated privacy. It never interfered with anyone's life. Yet it provided something far more valuable than video ever could. Awareness. The funny thing is, I don't think Denise ever truly understood why she lost that battle. She assumed the conflict was about cameras. It wasn't. It was about boundaries, about respect, about the dangerous belief that authority gives someone ownership over things that aren't theirs. The moment they crossed onto my property and decided their preferences mattered more than my rights, they created a problem they couldn't control. And in trying to eliminate a system they could see, they ended up creating one they couldn't. Even now, years later, I occasionally see HOA board members drive past my property a little slower than necessary. Maybe they're still curious. Maybe they're still wondering where the sensors are hidden. Maybe they're imagining technology that doesn't actually exist. Human beings are funny that way. Sometimes what we fear most isn't being watched. It's not knowing whether we're being watched. And that uncertainty can be louder than any camera hanging on a wall. So now I'm curious what you think. Did the HOA genuinely believe they were protecting the neighborhood? Or were they simply trying to control something they had no authority over? If you came home and found your property destroyed by people who thought they knew better, would you have accepted the reimbursement offer? Or would you have taken them to court anyway? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that's what makes them interesting. Sometimes the biggest neighborhood battles aren't about cameras, fences, or property lines at all. They're about how people react when they discover they don't have as much power as they thought.